Welcome back to Renewable Rides. Today, we're revisiting an episode that's evolved quite a bit since it first aired, our episode on the Ratepayer Protection Pledge. When we first talked about this, the pledge had just been announced in March and was signed by 7 tech companies: Google, Microsoft, Meta, Oracle, xAI, OpenAI, and Amazon. Since then, on July 23rd, the White House announced a major expansion. More than 200 additional utilities, data center developers, cooperatives, and states have now signed on. According to the White House, that brings the pledge's coverage up to companies delivering 80% of all power to U.S. homes and businesses. And it's not just industry lining up behind this, it's state governments as well. More than a dozen states have now considered moratoria on data centers, and New York just became the first state to actually enact a temporary ban this month. And maybe the most interesting political wrinkle, Texas Governor, Republican Greg Abbott, called for a ban on data center development in rural Texas on July 30th. And he's now among a bipartisan group of governors who've signed on to the pledge. So the politics we talk about in this episode haven't cooled off. They've only intensified. The ratepayer anxiety and the political pressure Gareth and I dig into here is now playing out at a much bigger scale with a lot more names attached to it. Keep all of that in mind as you listen to this highlight episode. The pledge has grown, the states are getting more aggressive, and the core tension in this conversation is only getting sharper. Let's get into it.
I think the big story here, Dan, is that the pledge reveals that the grid model that we've come to rely on is actually under serious strain. And most people don't even really understand that.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. And just to be clear, as we get going here, this is a voluntary pledge. So it's not some magic law that solves everything overnight. Really, it's the White House saying that big companies that are building these hyperscaling data centers will build, bring, or buy the power they need and pay for the delivery infrastructure upgrades and negotiate separate rate structures so that normal customers, both residences and businesses, are not subsidizing this AI growth.
Yeah, exactly. And it does sound great politically. But paying for the infrastructure is not the same as making it appear quickly enough, cheaply enough, or at the right prices. And I think this is where it gets actually really super interesting. And so I think the reason why this is happening now is ratepayer anxiety is becoming very real and very political. People are already feeling the pressure of higher bills, and the AI boom is giving politicians a very visible target. And it was really interesting reading in Bloomberg recently. They found that areas near significant data center activity experienced wholesale electricity prices that were as much as 267% higher than 5 years earlier. And so we've talked about this a lot before, Dan, of commercial rates in the last 4 years having gone up 22%, industrial rates 30%. They are real. They are what are written into the rates. But seeing this wholesale rate price so significantly jump is actually quite astounding. And so when politicians ask why ordinary households should be subsidizing big tech's power needs, that then leads to people and businesses already seeing these increases impacting their businesses, their operations, their family budgets. And that plays into their votes. It plays into the discussions we had with Chris on a few episodes back around our votes really influence people's political careers. And that's what's coming to the forefront.
And it's not just in Washington at a federal level. The AP reported that voter anger over rising electricity costs and fights over who pays for the AI infrastructure, they're already shaping the 26 midterm elections.
Yeah.
So it's no longer some niche utility policy discussion. It's becoming an election issue. And it's pretty wild that in just 5 years, electricity has really moved from this kind of invisible constant in life to a cornerstone of politics and boardroom discussions.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting. And Georgia, where we've spoken about a few times before for various reasons, but they're experiencing a very good example of what you're describing, where the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that Georgia's Senate special election was being actually reshaped over the backlash of a proposed $21 billion data center project. And this is with respect to energy, water, and land use becoming real defining issues for this race. And that's a huge signal. I think energy has moved from being non-impactful to these politicians to being very centered to local politics. because communities really are asking who's going to get the benefits and who's going to carry the risk of these developments.
Yeah, and Reuters reported that the White House rolled this pledge out ahead of the midterms, specifically to try to calm some fears around AI growth and the ramifications of consumer bills that come out of that. So politically, the administration is trying to head off backlash before it hardens into a bigger problem. Although I'd be curious to see how that actually plays out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the point of the pledge, isn't it? We want the AI growth, but we don't want ratepayers being crushed by it. And it is really good politics. I think this is becoming a very important issue, and it's good that they're being seen to address it. But I think it also explains how serious this issue has become. We've never had the federal government step up and make these sort of comments before. And when electricity bills, data centers, and grid strain start showing up in these special elections in the midterms, this has truly moved from a technical debate to basically kitchen table politics.
But let's give the pledge some credit. First, it acknowledges that an AI load or these very large loads are different in scale, speed, and visibility. Second, it acknowledges that the cost recovery matters. If a handful of giant private loads are driving new generation and delivery upgrades, it's reasonable to say that those costs should not simply be spread across all ratepayers or all consumers. And third, it pushes the market toward more disciplined conversations around dedicated supply, rate design, and infrastructure accountability. So maybe the biggest thing it gets right is that it admits that the old assumption that the grid will somehow just absorb all of this is no longer credible.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely an acknowledgement that low growth from AI is no longer abstract. It's definitely an operational issue. It's political and it's immediate. But I think here's where the conversation actually needs to go deeper, because this isn't just a cost allocation response. It's a system design issue. Because even if the hyperscalers were to pay and the grid had to do all the work, the generation still has to go and get built. We still have to find transmission capacity, and we have to permit it and build it 10, 15, 20-year cycles. The substations still have to be upgraded, and the turbines still have to be delivered. And these interconnection queues that we've talked about in the past still have to be moved and overcome. And, we're seeing, increasingly, the US Energy Information Administration said just in January that the country is on track for its fourth strongest power demand year since the year 2000, and it's driven by these computing centers. And Lawrence Berkeley National Lab says there are 10,300 projects still seeking interconnection, representing 1,400 gigawatts of generation and 890 gigawatts of storage.
That's what I think the layperson misses. That money doesn't compress time itself. These are infrastructure projects, and Reuters reported that gas turbine deliveries can take up to 5 years, while capital costs for these combined cycle gas plants have doubled in the rush to serve this new demand. So even if capital is available, the physical and bottlenecks are just really real and something that's not going to necessarily be overcome by some pledge.
Yeah, exactly. I think the ship has definitely sailed, and I think when we say the ship has sailed, what we mean is the market is already beyond the point where just go and build more central infrastructure, because that cannot be the only answer, because it's too slow, it's too capital intensive, it's too politically messy, and it actually faces a huge amount of social pushback, whether it be through NIMBYism, whether it be through people just not understanding and not supporting this infrastructure. And it leads to vulnerable bottlenecks that already exist and can increasingly compound.
And this is where, Gareth, you recently wrote about this idea of the great unbundling. And I think this is a great spot to touch on this, because it's demonstrating the fragility of this centralized infrastructure and why there's a better, different path. You can share a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think this is where the conversation gets super interesting, Dan, because I think from the utilities and the policymakers, they're expecting data centers to behave like flexible loads and to operate like many other businesses. And to be fair, there is some evidence that this is possible. Google have signed demand response agreements. They continue to lead the way in being able to flex some of their AI load. And there's new pilots showing that they can flex in near real time. But it really doesn't mean that this is how they want to operate. It doesn't mean that the AI infrastructure is designed to operate like that. And they really don't want to be operating like it's a discretionary load. They want clean power, they want high uptime, they want predictability, and they want performance certainty. They don't want voltage instability. They don't want to be curtailed because that impacts their revenues. And they definitely don't want to have their most expensive compute assets sitting underutilized because the grid cannot keep up.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of another podcast that I was just listening to recently, the Catalyst podcast, and they had Dr. Ben Lee on it, and he was talking about how these training data centers operate, right now as when they experience surprisingly large spikes in power demand as a result of how the power models or how the AI models are trained. These spikes are problematic. It's not just from the grid perspective, but the equipment inside the data centers as well. And to manage this, they create like dummy or phantom workloads to keep the power profile basically flat, but you're literally just wasting energy on nothing. And so this idea of flexibility, even if there is some flexibility, the AI companies don't want it and their infrastructure doesn't want it.
No, and the flexibility actually comes from not curtailing the actual work. It comes from curtailing the excess dummy work that was generated to try and provide this buffer. It's super interesting. And Harvard Belfer also shared that Northern Virginia, they experienced this voltage event in 2024. And as a result of this voltage event, around 60 data centers disconnected all at once because they couldn't handle this impact to their operations. And that caused a 1,500 megawatt swing and forced an emergency action by the utility. So it's a real reminder that these facilities are not just large loads, they're super sensitive infrastructure.
And so the grid wants flexibility, but the operators want certainty. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the grid is a very special being here, and that you need at all times a relatively constant meeting of supply and demand, where they're at odds here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think instead of talking about how do we make AI loads flexible, I think that's the wrong question and the wrong framing. I think instead we should be thinking about how do we design compute and power together so the system is actually inherently just more flexible, more resilient, more local, more controllable. And this is where I think the real opportunity emerges is training versus inference distinction really matters. So training today still requires huge campuses and tightly coordinated GPU clusters. So it makes sense to centralize those assets and have these big hyperscale facilities. But inference is actually very different, and it can often run in smaller clusters, much closer to the point of demand. And that is what makes edge inference super interesting, because inference does not need that same level of giant synchronized infrastructure. So it's much more amenable to this distributed energy deployment.
So really this is not cloud versus edge. It's really a layered architecture. So a hyperscale for training, smaller regional and metro nodes for a growing share of the inference, and maybe some narrower on-device functions as well, whether that be our personal computers or even our mobile devices. So it's not really saying that this is anti-cloud or anti-massive data centers. Those are part of the overall architecture and infrastructure for these AI companies, but it's really just another layer of cloud architecture. And once the compute starts to be distributed in that way, power can become distributed with it.
Yeah, I love this, because that's when we can really understand that energy and compute are very like for like. We can have big centralized infrastructure for certain situations. We can have distributed for other. And that's where our built environment and our buildings can become true energy infrastructure. Because once you accept that we can move to the edge, our view is that a meaningful share of this inference will move to these smaller, more strategically located assets. And we're seeing this actually playing out. We're seeing NVIDIA, EPRI, and Prologis and Infra Partners. They came to market and announced that they were exploring micro data centers, 5 to 20 megawatt range, placed near substations to support this distributed inference. So these are some of the biggest brands in the world. And where they're talking about it, it's a real opportunity. And this is also where I think policy response should go further. Instead of this pledge, if hyperscalers are going to fund infrastructure anyway, instead of just funding these major giant generation and transmission upgrades and trying to negotiate that with utilities, why aren't we thinking about how do we fund these community and business level on-site energy systems? Because that allows us to unlock massive amounts of capacity at the distribution level. It reduces the local grid pressure, improves resilience for everyone. It provides speed to power to these data center players, and it really builds on that social license to operate, which is at risk of blocking many of these projects.
And it's a very different use of capital. It's less of this upstream requiring all this downstream infrastructure to get it to where it needs to be, and it's more distributed and more local. And I think there's already a lot of capacity hiding in plain sight. And I was just recently at an industrial real estate asset owner conference, and I think it's a huge opportunity for these companies that already have these assets, and some of which are underutilized, or others they're looking for ways to generate more revenue out of them. It's leveraging a lot of the built infrastructure that we already have.
Yeah. I think, Dan, we've talked about the number of properties in the past, but, if you remove industrial properties here and just talk about commercial buildings, there's 5.9 million commercial buildings. And according to the EIA, last year they consumed 4,000 trillion BTUs of electricity, which translates into roughly 1.2 terawatt hours per year, or around 137 gigawatts of average electrical load. So huge and very significant. And if you pair that with the fact that Grid Strategies says the US system today operates at about a 60% load factor, if you use that as a rough proxy, the infrastructure serving those commercial loads implies that we're accounting for 228 gigawatts of peak capacity against 137 gigawatts of average use. So that's about a 91 gigawatt difference between the average utilization and the peak serving. And so if you're going to unlock that, you create a huge opportunity. And I think we agree that we can't unlock all of that. But if we actually start applying these smarter controls, we start combining it with on-site solar, batteries, hybrid systems, with coordinated load management, even if you could unlock 10 to 25% of that headroom, that's 9 to 23 gigawatts of extra power that we don't have to go and generate more, centralized assets. That's sat there that we've designed for today, but we're just not utilizing it in the way we should.
It's such a meaningful number. These are massive numbers. And because now we're not just talking about tiny niche savings, we're talking about real system scale and capacity and leveraging the infrastructure that we've already paid for and built and have been a part of these utility rate cases that are getting passed on in the bills that we pay today. And I think it's really importantly, it's the capacity that can be unlocked much faster with far less capital intensive requirements than waiting the next decade for this mega transmission and central generation upgrades. So instead of only funding the giant upstream assets, we should be asking the hyperscalers to fund the local on-site systems, the smarter controls, the coordinated distribution level capacity that would be better for our communities, better for resilience, and in many cases better for the speed to power, and be a more holistic solution than continuing to just think about the centralized infrastructure. So what's the key takeaway for business leaders that are listening here, Gareth, and infrastructure owners like the industrial asset owners that I was talking about?
Yeah, I think the pledge highlights that we need to all stop assuming that the utility timelines and the centralized grid is going to line up with our market needs. Second, we need to start thinking about sites in terms of enabled capacity. So, how much square footage do we have available? How much capacity do we have at our site level transformer? How much could we generate on site? How much can you really help unlock this opportunity for the market? If you own these commercial industrial real estate assets, you need to recognize that energy infrastructure, it needs to become a very strategic part of your value proposition. This could actually be the biggest revenue generating opportunity for your business beyond your core business. And fourth, if you're a policymaker, ratepayer, protection should not just mean reallocating the cost of these giant grid upgrades to the data center players. It should be, how do we actually enable local capacity creation? And lastly, I'd say, if you're a hyperscaler or major AI infrastructure player, think very carefully about social license to operate, because communities are much more likely to support your growth if they see the local benefits, the local resilience, the system value, not just strain on the grid and increased rates. We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.